One must look back more than 70 years to reach the time when these two bright young persons were, for a short time, intimately acquainted with each other, and then separated on their several courses, never to meet again, both destined to attain some distinction in their different ways, one to survive the other for more than half a century, yet in his extreme old age to remember and speak, as he sometimes did, of his former companion as one to be much admired, and not easily forgotten by those who had ever known her.
You have already given, in a few sentences, the chief part of what my late venerable uncle told me. He did not state in what her fascination consisted, but he said in so many words that he was in love with her, although he qualified his confession by saying it was a boyish love. As this occurred in a friendly and private conversation, I feel some doubt whether I ought to make it public.
I think I need not warn you against raking up that old story about the still living Chief Justice. That there was something in it is true, but very little out of the common way, as I believe. Nothing to call ill usage, and no very serious sorrow endured. It was a disappointment. But Mrs. Lefroy sent the gentleman off at the end of a very few weeks, that no more mischief might be done.
You scold me so much in the nice long letter which I have this moment received from you, that I am almost afraid to tell you how my Irish friend and I behaved. Imagine to yourself everything most profligate and shocking in the way of dancing and sitting down together. I could expose myself, however, only once more, because he leaves the country soon after next Friday, on which day we are to have a dance at Ash after all. Hey guys, welcome back. I'm recording off camera today because my apartment is a complete mess, and also I'm a bit under the weather. Sorry for my long absence, firstly. I did have some ideas for videos over the last year, but they just didn't end up panning out. And then I've had this idea for a while, and I kind of saw an opportunity for bringing together two things that I very much love, which is the analysis that I do on this channel and also Jane Austen. I kind of approached it firstly with a sense of like I was going to be making a lot out of a very small connection, and I will be explaining the story of Jane Austen and her Irish friend in the course of this video. I actually ended up discovering more as I went along, some interesting things that surprised me. But really the impetus for making this video was when I rewatched Becoming Jane last year. And so I first saw this movie, I was about 10 years old when it came out, and my mom brought me along to it with her friend. So I remember really enjoying it in cinemas. I don't think I understood all of it. Then when I got into my teens, I became absolutely obsessed with Jane Austen. And so my attitude towards this movie kind of changed, and I became kind of annoyed by its very existence. I think this had to do with the fact, A, that Anne Hathaway was also very hated for a while for absolutely no reason as an actress. I also, for some reason, misremembered and thought that James McAvoy did a really bad Irish accent in this. Actually, when I rewatched it, I discovered that he doesn't do any Irish accent at all. I think it had to do with the fact that Tom Lefroy, the person, wouldn't have spoken with what we would perceive as an Irish accent. But before we get into it, first a little bit about me. I'm outstanding in my field. I make video essays on Irish representation in media and Irish media in general. If you're interested in this kind of content and you'd like to support me, please do like and subscribe. Thanks, and enjoy the video.
Thomas Langlaw Lefroy was born in 1776 in Limerick, Ireland. He studied at Trinity College, Dublin from 1790 to 1793 and was known to have a brilliant academic record. His great-uncle, Benjamin Langlois, supported Tom's legal studies later on in Lincoln's Inn in London. In 1799, Tom Lefroy married Mary Paul. Mary Paul's family came from Wexford, but Tom and Mary married in Wales because her family had fled the insurrection of 1798. During this failed rebellion in Ireland, Silver Spring, the estate that was owned by the Pauls, was occupied by the rebels. In 1829, Lefroy opposed the Roman Catholic Relief Act. This act allowed Irish Catholics into Parliament if they met a certain property qualification. In 1837, Lefroy built Carraglass Manor, a Gothic manor house in an estate in Longford that he had acquired some years before. Lefroy became Lord Chief Justice of Ireland in 1852. He was still serving in 1866 at the age of 90. He died in 1869. 2 years later, his son Thomas published a memoir of Chief Justice Lefroy, in the same year that the second edition of a memoir of Jane Austen was published by one of her nephews. Jane Austen is often regarded as one of the greatest English novelists of all time. She was born in Steventon in Hampshire, 1775. She had 6 brothers and 1 sister. Her father, a clergyman, the Reverend George Austen, also worked as a tutor. Many of Jane's early attempts at writing included parodies of popular romances. During the 1790s, she worked on early drafts of Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice, and Northanger Abbey. Her father retired in 1801 and the family moved to Bath. After George Austen's death in 1805, Jane, her mother and her sister moved first to Southampton and then in 1809 to Chawton in Hampshire. This was where Jane Austen would revise her first 3 novels and write 3 more: Mansfield Park, Emma and Persuasion. In 1817, at the age of 41, Jane Austen succumbed to what many now believe to be Hodgkin's disease, a cancer of the immune system. She was brought to Winchester for medical treatment and died there. Before we get into discussing Becoming Jane, let's look at the real-life timeline of Tom and Jane's interactions. Jane Austen and Tom Lefroy met and got to know each other over the course of 3 neighbourhood balls in the winter of 1795 to 1796. Tom was staying with his aunt and uncle at Ash Rectory, which was not far from Jane's home in Steventon. Tom and Jane's behaviour at these balls was noted by neighbours and acquaintances, as they danced together more often than was considered proper at the time. The gossip about Jane and Tom apparently reached such a point that Tom was too embarrassed to see Jane and avoided her when she came to call at Ash. However, a few days later he called on her at Steventon. At the 3rd and last ball, Jane Austen expected Tom to make an offer of marriage to her. We do not know whether she was joking or not when she said this. No offer was made, it seems. 2 years later, Jane Austen, during a visit from Tom Lefroy's aunt, was anxious to hear some news of him, but, as she admitted in a letter to her sister Cassandra, too proud to make any inquiries. So, was that all? Not according to Becoming Jane. Becoming Jane was released in 2007, directed by Julian Gerald. It's adapted from the 2003 book, which is a biographical reimagining of Jane Austen's life, called Becoming Jane Austen by John Spence. Becoming Jane, the film, posits that Jane and Tom were in love, that Tom did in fact make her an offer of marriage at that last ball, but due to the interference of disapproving relatives and jealous neighbours, the two were eventually forced to part ways. Tom married for money, and Jane devoted herself to her writing. The film ends with a 20 years later scene, during which Jane reads an extract from her most famous novel, Pride and Prejudice, to a small gathering of admirers, which includes Tom Lefroy and his daughter. As the film's epilogue informs us, this daughter was called Jane. However, in real life, Tom's daughter Jane was more likely named after his mother-in-law, and not Jane Austen.
I think it's a good part. It's a great part. You get to be Mr. Darcy, but a little bit have more fun with it, really.
Jane Austen had originally written Pride and Prejudice under the name First Impressions, a novel in epistolary form. In 1797, her father had submitted it to Cadell Publishers, but it ended up being rejected. Later on, Jane revised it into what we now know as Pride and Prejudice, and it was published in 1813. Jane commented on the novel in a letter to her sister Cassandra, joking that it wasn't serious enough to fit with the standards of literature at the time. The work is rather too light and bright and sparkling. It wants shade, it wants to be stretched out here and there with a long chapter of sense if it could be had, if not, of solemn, specious nonsense, about something unconnected with the story, an essay on writing, a critique on Walter Scott, or the history of Bonaparte. In another letter to Cassandra, Jane also stated that Elizabeth Bennet was her favourite character that she had created. Pride and Prejudice revolves around the Bennet family, who live in the Longbourn estate in Hertfordshire in England. Mr. Bennet's estate is entailed, meaning that it will pass to a male heir. Unfortunately, he has only daughters, 5 daughters in fact. Since Mrs. Bennet doesn't have an inheritance, it's imperative that one of the daughters marries well in order to support the other ones. The family is therefore very excited when 2 rich gentlemen arrive in the neighbourhood of Hertfordshire, Mr. Bingley and Mr. Darcy.
So which of the painted peacocks is our Mr. Bingley?
Well, he's on the right and on the left is his sister.
And the person with the quizzical brow?
That is his good friend, Mr. Darcy.
He looks miserable, poor soul.
Miserable he may be, but poor he most certainly is not.
Tell me.
10,000 a year, and he earns half of Derbyshire.
Mr. Bingley is instantly struck with the eldest Bennet sister, Jane. Mr. Darcy, on the other hand, is much more aloof and rude, and Elizabeth, the second Bennet sister, forms a dislike of Mr. Darcy. The heir to the Longbourn estate is a distant cousin of Mr. Bennet called Mr. Collins. Mr. Collins wants to find a wife and has decided that he's going to choose one of the Bennet sisters. This would be a great thing, at least in Mrs. Bennet's eyes, because it would mean that one of the girls will end up inheriting the estate through marriage. Mr. Collins pursues Elizabeth, who turns him down. However, Mr. Collins has trouble believing this at first since, as he says, Elizabeth is unlikely to get any better offers of marriage.
So I must conclude that you simply seek to increase my love by suspense.
Sir.
According to the usual practice of elegant females.
Sir.
Elizabeth's mother is also furious at her for turning down Mr. Collins's offer. Around the same time, Elizabeth meets the charming army officer, Wickham. And as Elizabeth notices, there's a lot of tension between him and Mr. Darcy. Wickham tells her a story about Mr. Darcy cheating him out of his inheritance, since their fathers were family friends. Elizabeth's family are getting very excited about the prospect of Jane marrying Mr. Bingley, and they start behaving in very embarrassing ways. Mr. Bingley's sister and Mr. Darcy decide to take him away from the neighbourhood, since they think that his association with such a family will only do him harm. Meanwhile, Mr. Collins has quickly consoled himself by marrying Elizabeth's best friend, Charlotte Lucas. Elizabeth goes to visit her friend, and in so doing encounters Mr. Darcy again. Elizabeth is very surprised when one day Mr. Darcy declares undying love to her and proposes marriage to her. She's also very offended, as he admits he has no practical reasons for proposing to someone who has such low connections as her. She quickly turns him down, and Mr. Darcy is very surprised. However, later he writes a letter to Elizabeth, defending himself against her reasons for turning him down. Elizabeth had cited two reasons. Firstly, for Mr. Darcy's involvement in getting Mr. Bingley away from Jane, which broke her sister's heart. And secondly, Wickham's story about how Darcy cheated him out of the inheritance. Darcy tells Elizabeth that she's right about what he did to save his friend from an imprudent marriage, but that she's wrong about the Wickham story. And he tells her that actually Wickham was given his inheritance, but ended up gambling it and drinking it away very quickly. Wickham also tried to seduce Mr. Darcy's younger sister, Georgiana, but only to get her money.
She is to inherit £30,000. When it was made clear he would never receive a penny of that inheritance, he disappeared.
Elizabeth is surprised and humbled by this revelation and begins to revise her opinion of Mr. Darcy. Elizabeth's younger sister Lydia gets very excited when she's invited on a trip to Brighton. Lydia is obsessed with army officers, and at Brighton there are going to be many of them. Elizabeth tries to persuade her father not to let Lydia go, but Mr. Bennet says that no harm will come of it. When Elizabeth is on a trip to Derbyshire with her aunt and uncle, they end up visiting Pemberley, Darcy's estate. Elizabeth is really embarrassed when she encounters Darcy there because she had heard before that he was away, and that was the only reason she visited. Darcy, however, makes a big effort with Elizabeth's aunt and uncle and is obviously very happy to see her. Elizabeth then gets a letter from home that Lydia in Brighton has run away with Wickham. She's so upset by this news that Mr. Darcy asks her what's wrong, and Elizabeth tells him before returning home to Longbourn where she can support her family. It very quickly emerges from the next few letters that they receive that Wickham has no intention of marrying Lydia and is going to live with her instead in London. This would be disastrous for Elizabeth and her sisters, as it means that none of them will be able to marry because their reputations, tied to their sister's reputation, will be ruined. Suddenly, however, they hear that Wickham and Lydia have in fact married, and Elizabeth only later hears that Mr. Darcy was in fact behind this, that he paid Wickham off to marry Lydia. He, however, didn't want anyone to find out about this, and it's through Lydia that Elizabeth learns this news. Mr. Bingley and Mr. Darcy come back into the neighbourhood. Mr. Bingley proposes to Jane, which she accepts, and soon after, Mr. Darcy proposes to Elizabeth. This time she also accepts him.
The film Becoming Jane was based on the book Becoming Jane Austen by John Hunter Spence, which was published in 2003. And this is a semi-biographical, but more like a kind of an imagining of, Tom Lefroy being the love of Jane Austen's life and how this inspired her genius. One thing I find interesting, John Hunter Spence actually posited that Elizabeth Bennet was based on Tom Lefroy because of their kind of lively personalities being similar, and that Jane Austen herself was had more in common with Mr. Darcy. I thought that was interesting. I still am not convinced myself, but it's better than the Tom Lefroy equals Mr. Darcy interpretations that really picked up around the time of Becoming Jane's release. And I think it has much to do with the fact that Pride and Prejudice is Jane Austen's most famous work. So it tends to be, people's first contact with Jane Austen tends to be through Pride and Prejudice.
You get to be Mr. Darcy, but a little bit have more fun with it, really.
There's definitely some similarities in terms of how the initial courtship plays out between the two characters in the film. We see how when Tom Lefroy first comes to the neighbourhood of Steventon, that he is dismissive of Jane. He kind of says something a bit dismissive about her, and then she in turn is kind of dismissive about him, and we have this back and forth that you really see in the adaptations of Pride and Prejudice, and which really has come to symbolise the Elizabeth Bennet Mr. Darcy relationship. But I would argue that when you look at the book Pride and Prejudice, this kind of dynamic is very different. Part of what's evolved for us, I think, from the most iconic Pride and Prejudice adaptations is this idea that Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy are mutually attracted to each other from the start, but this is very much not the case. Rather, in the book, even Mr. Darcy is not impressed by Elizabeth at first. He does become attracted to her and gradually falls in love with her, but we don't actually see Elizabeth reciprocate his feelings until like the last quarter of the novel. And yeah, I mean, this has been kind of become a joke as well, because often people say, well, she only fell in love with him when she saw his beautiful grounds at Pemberley and she realised how rich he was. It's funny. It's not really what happens. I mean, she falls in love with him because she sees that he changed for her, that he really put in the work to become a better person, to revise his own prejudices about her and about her sister. And she also grows in respect of him because she learns how he really handled the whole Wickham situation. And she sees how he's very much respected by his servants, all this kind of thing. And how he treats her aunt and uncle very civilly and very kindly. So it's more boring really than the fantastic courtship that we've seen develop in the adaptations, where there is this mutual attraction from the start. So I would say that this is the first difference, because in Becoming Jane we see this mutual attraction right from the start, this very much I hate him but I'm also attracted to him thing.
Where exactly in Ireland does he come from anyway?
Limerick, Miss Austen.
Another difference that we can see is the way that, I mean, quite obviously, Mr. Darcy and Tom Lefroy have very little in common. Maybe they're both eldest sons in their families, but Mr. Darcy has, as we know, 10,000 a year.
I have no money, no property. I am entirely dependent upon that bizarre old lunatic, my uncle. I cannot yet offer marriage, but you must know what I feel.
This is another big difference. I mean, the most that we see in Pride and Prejudice is that Darcy's aunt, Lady Catherine de Bourgh, takes a very active interest in who he's going to marry. But she has absolutely no say. I think the similarities that we see play out are a very interesting example of intertextuality. Intertextuality is a term often used in discussing adaptations, literary adaptations in particular, and it has to do with how two texts deal with each other. So how the source material and the adaptation deal with each other in a sense, rather than this older idea of source material being the basis and then adaptation growing from that. Now, of course, one will predate the other, but in terms of what we encounter first as readers or viewers, that will depend on what is readily available to us. For me, for instance, My first encounter with Jane Austen was either that seeing Sense and Sensibility on TV or seeing the 2005 Pride and Prejudice, and this obviously coloured the way that I approached Jane Austen when I started to read her books. So the 2007 Becoming Jane, to this effect, I think brings out of some of the very strong elements of 2005's Pride and Prejudice. One of the things I like the most about the 2005 Pride and Prejudice, in comparison, let's say, to the 1995 version, which is much more beloved, is that the 2005 film really tries to hammer home the economic point. It has this kind of raggedy quality, everything is quite dirty. It also tries to humanize the characters that make choices based on economic necessity. For instance, we see Charlotte berate Lizzie for not understanding her reasons for marrying Mr. Collins.
I've been offered a comfortable home and protection. There's a lot to be thankful for.
Charlotte.
I'm 27 years old. I've no money and no prospects. I'm already a burden to my parents.
Very much not present in the book. In the book, you are supposed to condemn Charlotte for marrying a man that she doesn't love or respect. And similarly, in Becoming Jane, we see how Steventon parsonage is overcrowded, how Jane is struggling as one of many children, and how her parents in turn want to give her the best upbringing that they possibly can, but are also limited in what they can provide. We have that scene between Jane and her father where he explains to her that no matter how much you might love someone, poverty can really break your spirit. I think this is one of the strongest elements of the film. It's partly what I was so surprised by when I came back to watching it last year. I like the details, like how Jane's costumes are reused. There are certainly some anachronisms there as well in terms of the lack of bonnets. We've seen this though in a lot of period adaptations. So Becoming Jane is definitely not the only offender in this category. As to the question whether or not Tom Lefroy was the basis for Mr. Darcy, I would say a resounding no.
So while Pride and Prejudice, both book and its various adaptations, does have this grounding in economic reality, it's a story about two lovers overcoming internal obstacles, their own biases against each other, whereas the romance in Becoming Jane is about external obstacles. Once Tom and Jane have realised their feelings for each other, which happens quite early in the film, the only thing standing in their way is the disapproval of Tom's relatives and the interference of Jane's neighbours. So I think that the similarity between Pride and Prejudice and Becoming Jane is more of a kind of a chicken and egg scenario. Because an adaptation of Pride and Prejudice had come out 2 years before, Becoming Jane ended up resembling a lot through this process of intertextuality that we talked about. And because Pride and Prejudice is Jane Austen's most famous work, I think it's used in the film as a summary of her genius. The film can't pay homage to all 6 of her novels, so it chooses instead to focus on her most famous one. In 1869, Caroline Austen wrote a letter to her brother, James Edward Austen-Leigh, or J.E.A.L. as I'll now refer to him. J.E.A.L. was working on a memoir of their aunt, Jane Austen, at the time. Caroline wrote to her brother advising him on how he should discuss Jane and Tom Lefroy's meeting at Steventon.
I think I need not warn you against raking up that old story about the still living Chief Justice. That there was something in it is true, but very little out of the common way, as I believe. Nothing to call ill usage, and no very serious sorrow endured. It was a disappointment. But Mrs. Lefroy sent the gentleman off at the end of a very few weeks, that no more mischief might be done.
So what was this ill usage that Caroline Austen is referring to here? How could someone feel betrayed by someone else deciding that they were no longer interested in them? That's just a fact of modern dating. But at the time that Jane Austen and Tom Lefroy first met, the social and legal consequences of what was called breach of honour were very different. Essentially, if a gentleman became engaged to a lady and then broke his word, she could in fact bring him to court. This was because breach of honour was had very serious consequences against women's reputations. It could ruin their chances of a future marriage. And as we've already seen, marriage back in this time for women of Jane Austen's class was very much an economic proposition.
As we see, for instance, in Sense and Sensibility, which is Jane Austen's first published novel. We see how Edward Ferrars, who's the romantic hero, struggles for so long with his love for Eleanor because he is bound by an old engagement to Lucy Steele, who's not right for him at all.
Eleanor. Eleanor, I met Lucy when I was very young. Had I had an active profession, I should never have felt such an idle, foolish inclination.
But how does this relate to Jane and Tom? Well, if we're to take Jane's prediction that Tom was going to propose to her seriously, and if we're then to look at the fact that Tom ended up marrying a young lady who had a lot of money, and that around this same time Jane Austen was anxious to hear news of him but too proud to make any inquiries, the interpretation that tends to suggest itself is that Tom Lefroy led Jane Austen on and then abandoned her, and this would be what was called ill usage. This interpretation of Tom Lefroy's behaviour obviously doesn't paint him in a very positive light.
One of Tom's descendants, Lieutenant Colonel Patrick Lefroy, wrote an article in the 80s refuting the idea that Tom married Mary Paul for money. Patrick Lefroy asserted that Mary Paul only inherited Silver Spring after her brother died. Her brother Thomas, again too many Toms, was Tom Lefroy's friend and apparently his first connection into the Paul family. We know that Tom Lefroy met Thomas Paul at university, and therefore that it was possible that he had an understanding with Mary Paul, Thomas's sister, prior to his ever meeting Jane Austen. So remember, Tom and Jane met in the winter of 1795-1796. Now, the official engagement was not announced until 1797, and as I've said, they didn't get married until 1799. So if we take the reading that Tom was already engaged secretly prior to his meeting Austen, which is the interpretation that his descendant takes, this makes the love story between them very one-sided.
How serious was all this? Unfortunately, we have only one side of the story, Jane's. From the letters which have come down to us, it is fairly clear that Jane made all the running. She was evidently attracted to Tom, but would she have married him? She says not, but we are left wondering, as she does not protest too much. And Tom, might his reluctance to become embroiled at Steventon have been due not only to fear of ridicule, but to memories of someone else in Ireland?
Now, of course, he was drawing from some of the same sources as we're drawing from for this video, which were Jane Austen's letters to Cassandra, and he mentions that Jane pointed to Tom running away when she tried to call on him. For he is so excessively laughed at about me at Ash that he's ashamed of coming to Steventon and ran away when we called on Mrs. Lefroy a few days ago. I personally don't know whether I would even take her use of the phrase ran away literally. I think she maybe meant that Tom did everything he could to avoid meeting her or to avoid being at home when she called. But a lot of subsequent analyses seem to have taken this view that he must have physically ran away from the house and that she had seen him do this. Patrick Lefroy's account does contain some inaccuracies. For one thing, he very definitively attributes Tom's reasons for visiting Steventon at the time that he met Jane Austen to poor health. In fact, we know from letters exchanged between Benjamin Langlois, Tom's great-uncle, and Tom's father, that he did have problems with his eyesight, but that this was only the case in 1792 and 1793. But certainly his assertion that Mary Paul only became an heiress after their marriage seems quite likely, and it seems to be backed up as well from the Memoir of Thomas Lefroy, which contains similar information.
I have no money. No property. I am entirely dependent upon that bizarre old lunatic, my uncle.
So who is this bizarre old lunatic? Benjamin Langlois was actually Tom Lefroy's great-uncle. He was Tom's main benefactor. He paid for Tom's education at Trinity College, Dublin, and this meant that he was also the arbiter on whom Tom married. In a letter written in 1763 to the Duke of Portland, Benjamin Langlois did refer to the Irish as savages. So the fact that Benjamin had subsidised his great-nephew's education and also the education of some of Tom's siblings is kind of strange in this context, but there are hints in the Memoir of Thomas Lefroy that Benjamin Langlois wanted to persuade Tom to practice in England instead of Ireland for this reason, for his dislike of the Irish. What this also gives us some interesting hints towards is that Benjamin might have actually approved of Austen as a match for Tom because she was English. And this is certainly suggested in the film. After Tom and Jane's initial flirtation, when they decide to get married, they go to Cork Street in London to get Benjamin Langlois' approval. And it's all going very well until an acquaintance of Jane's back in Steventon writes to Benjamin Langlois before they have time to announce the engagement to him, and he gets then a prejudice against Jane Austen.
They think that they can do what they like with us, but I will not accept this.
We have no choice.
The visit to Cork Street does have some basis in reality. It was actually John Spence, the writer of Becoming Jane Austen, who discovered this. But there is a letter from Jane Austen to Cassandra, written in August 1796 from Cork Street in London. And it is very likely that she wrote this from Benjamin Langlois' address and that she was staying with him at the time. Because Tom wouldn't have been studying in Lincoln's Inn at this time, as it was the summer term, it's unlikely that he would have been there, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the visit was unrelated to him. Spence and also another Jane Austen scholar, Linda Robinson Walker, have analysed this letter, suggesting that Jane's tone in it is more anxious than in some of her other letters. I won't read the letter, but I will provide the text of it here so that you can have a look for yourselves. For my own part, I'm not sure if I see that it is anxious, maybe just a little bit distracted, and certainly shorter than her other letters. But given that we know many of Jane's letters to Cassandra are missing, this also suggests to us that there could have been other important contextual letters explaining this visit to Cork Street. Linda Walker, working from what some other Jane Austen scholars had discovered, suggests that there could have been a final meeting between Jane and Tom in Bath, which would have occurred in late 1797, so after Tom's engagement, but before his marriage. The evidence for this is kind of convoluted, but basically we know from a family record that Jane and her mother and sister went to Bath in late 1797 to see Thomas Lefroy's cousin perform on horseback. The second piece of evidence that confirms this is a letter written by Jane to Cassandra in 1805. 7 years and 4 months ago, we went to the same riding house to see Miss Lefroy's performance. What a different set are we now moving in. But 7 years, I suppose, are enough to change every pore of one's skin and every feeling of one's mind. A lot had occurred between these two dates, for instance the death of Jane's father, their move from Steventon, and also the death of Mrs. Lefroy. This was Tom's aunt. She was good enough friends with the family that Jane Austen actually wrote a poem in tribute to her after she died. A more oblique connection that suggests this final meeting in Bath is Jane Austen's final novel, Persuasion, which is partly set in Bath, and which also involves two lovers who are separated from each other for 7 years. So we have a kind of a rough timeline of at least leading up to Tom's marriage in 1799, which does leave some room for doubt, and these contradictory accounts of whether or not he indeed married for money are certainly a bit confusing as well. I would say that since we know for a fact that Benjamin Langlois disliked the Irish, that Tom would really have had to marry a good match in order to get his approval. And since Mary Paul was Irish, I assume there must have been promising prospects, whether or not she was in fact an heiress. So I think it's likely that Tom married for money or some other practical reasons. Of course, this doesn't preclude that he might have also loved Mary Paul, we don't know. But something that Tom Lefroy's descendant in the 80s doesn't mention is that Thomas Lefroy also had a brother called Anthony. Anthony Lefroy had had a commission in the army purchased for him by Benjamin Langlois. Then he ended up angering the Langlois, as we know from scholar Deirdre Faye's work. It was Anthony Lefroy's marriage that ended up alienating him from Benjamin Langlois and the other members of the Langlois family. He married Elizabeth Wilkin in 1798, but there was some objection, we don't know what exactly. Subsequent to this, Tom Lefroy later helped out his brother by getting him a job as a barrack master in York, and this is where the Anthony Lefroy branch of the families eventually settled. His son was the very same nephew who eventually confirmed Tom Lefroy's love for Jane.
He did not state in what her fascination consisted, but he said in so many words that he was in love with her, although he qualified his confession by saying it was a boyish love.
There's also another indication that he may have taken an interest in her career, found in the same letter which Caroline Austen wrote to JEAL in 1869, which we had an extract from earlier in this video. Same letter, she says that Tom Lefroy purchased a copy of a rejection letter. This letter was from the publisher Cadell and Davies that had originally rejected a proposal of Pride and Prejudice that was sent to them in 1797.
I enclose a copy of Mr. Austen's letter to Cadell. The letter does not do much credit to the tact or courtesy of our good grandfather, for Cadell was a great man in his day, and it is not surprising that he should have refused the favour so offered from an unknown. But the circumstance may be worth noting, especially as we have so few incidents to produce. At a sale of Cadell's papers, etc., Tom Lefroy picked up the original letter, and Jemima copied it for me.
Now, what's a little bit confusing here is that we know that Caroline Austen referred to Tom Lefroy as the Chief Justice earlier in the letter. So why would she have switched and referred to him just as Tom Lefroy later on? This is most likely explained by the fact that she's actually talking about his nephew, T.E.P. Lefroy, Thomas Edward Preston Lefroy, and calling him Tom Lefroy for short.
This, however, could have been a service he was performing for his uncle, as Tom Lefroy by this time was based in Ireland, but his nephew was likely based around York, where his family had settled. So it's quite possible that Tom Lefroy, the elder, asked his nephew to purchase this letter on his behalf. Given that we know from Jane's letters to Cassandra that Tom and Jane did discuss literature, or at least that they discussed Tom Jones, which is also shown in the film, this would suggest a kind of a meeting of minds, two intellectual equals. Jane Austen and Tom Lefroy not only went on to both have public careers, though one of them after her death, but they were also on the same level intellectually. And this is significant when we talk about their love story. In the film Becoming Jane, we see Tom advising Jane on her writing. While it's unlikely that this would have happened since she only really discussed her writing with her family, it's a common trope in period pieces about female writers.
You should be writing from life, from the depths of your soul. There is nothing in here of the woman that I am privileged to know.
However, here we run into another contradiction in terms of how Tom is portrayed. His descendant, who wrote the article in the 80s, was quite indignant at this interpretation of Tom as a kind of wild, carousing figure that had apparently grown up around this love story. Because, as I was saying earlier, it was assumed that Tom had jilted Jane, there was this kind of playful, roguish character created. Patrick Lefroy and also other Jane Austen scholars like Joan Klingel, for example, have argued that this image of Tom Lefroy was far from the truth. They point to letters from Thomas's tutor at Trinity College and also from Benjamin Langlois that suggested that Tom was the most well-behaved young gentleman imaginable. These letters do certainly paint a portrait of a very dutiful son and nephew, a very responsible and honourable man, who would therefore have been unlikely to have trifled with Jane. Austen describes their flirtation, albeit jokingly, as profligate and shocking. She also mentions Tom Jones, which was a very shocking novel at the time, which they both discuss, and this gives a hint to the kind of the more risque aspect of their courtship. But I haven't yet addressed really the elephant in the room, Tom's Irishness. In the film, Tom's introduction shows us him boxing in Bond Street in London. This is very much deliberate. Throughout the film we have this contrast between Tom's athleticism and the kind of the weak sickliness of the other gentlemen who vie for Austen's affection. In that introductory scene in Bond Street, we also see Tom drinking and in general behaving like a stage Irishman. If you haven't seen my video on the stage Irishman, I really would recommend it. It gives some helpful insight to the kind of tropes that have developed over the last few centuries in plays and films and books around Irish people. Tom's Irishness, therefore, is used as a device in the film to really put him at an advantage compared to the other men in the neighbourhood.
In Love à la Mode, which was a farce first played in 1759, the heroine is forced to choose between several different young men who are each vying for her affections, and the one whom she eventually ends up choosing, who is portrayed as more noble, albeit a bit simpler than the others, is Sir Callahan O'Bralaghan, the Irish character, who is very much another example of this kind of positive stage Irishman. Sir Callahan O'Bralaghan shares some similarities with the way Tom Lefroy is portrayed in this film. He's athletic, strong, honourable, and has a lot of these kind of earthy qualities that are associated with this positive idea of stage Irishman. And I discussed this more in my video on the topic, but the negative aspects of the stage Irishman are also pretty well known by now, but they include, being promiscuous or amorous, hard drinking, cunning, sly, and this kind of thing. We do see some of the examples of this in the introductory scene of Tom Lefroy, but it is not consistent with his overall portrayal in the film.
What value will there be in life if we are not together?
This question that we see him pose is also central to the film's theme. What was the value of this love story if these two young people were only to be torn apart?
The major conflict is between Jane's writing and Tom.
I can earn money.
It will not be enough.
Because the film is so grounded in this economic reality, this is a choice that has to be made. Jane cannot choose both. If she chooses Tom, they both will be so ground down by poverty that she won't have any space or luxury to write. But it's also the interference of Benjamin Langlois and several other characters in the film who have made this an impossibility, because if they were to help the young couple, then Tom Lefroy and Jane Austen might have actually had a chance. And I hope, as we've seen in this section, that it's clear that there is actually some basis in reality for a lot of this. If it is true that the young couple were broken up, separated, my money would be on Benjamin Langlois. We know for a fact that Benjamin Langlois reacted very badly when one of his great nephews married someone he didn't approve of, and that Tom Lefroy later intervened to get his brother a job. I want to just note here that I keep using the same screenshot of Ian Richardson's portrayal of Benjamin Langlois from the film because I couldn't actually find a picture of Benjamin Langlois. This was in fact Ian Richardson's final role. Did Tom get his brother a job, not only through a sense of familial duty, but because he felt sympathy for his predicament? Perhaps because he regretted his own choice to marry money instead of marrying for love? Could Tom's closeness to the son that his brother would later have be connected to this kind of solidarity? As Caroline confirms for us, we know that Mrs. Lefroy sent Tom away, meaning that she cut his visit short after it became clear that there was a flirtation going on between him and Jane Austen.
Well, Mrs. Lefroy sent the gentleman off at the end of a very few weeks, that no more mischief might be done.
But because Jane was so obviously fond of Mrs. Lefroy, Tom's aunt, I think it's doubtful that she would have still had such fond memories of her after she had taken such an active part in breaking the two up.
In fact, another one of Jane Austen's nieces later confirmed that Mrs. Lefroy was more an ally to Jane and Tom than their enemy. As an interesting side note, Anna Lefroy, Jane Austen's niece, had married, in fact, Tom Lefroy's cousin in 1814. So the two families were linked together through marriage, at least.
Some persons have surmised that she took her characters from individuals with whom she had been acquainted. They were so lifelike that it was assumed that they must once have lived, and have been transferred bodily, as it were, into her pages. But surely such a supposition betrays an ignorance of the high prerogative of genius to create out of its own resources imaginary characters who shall be true to nature and consistent in themselves.
What JEAL very rightly points out here is that writing is not this one-to-one process of observing people in your real life and then transferring them onto paper into fictional characters. However, when we look at Jane Austen's novels, her characters and settings and subject matter are all things that are very much rooted in her real life experience. We know that she was aware of this because from some letters that she sent to her niece, who was contemplating writing at the time, we got a little bit of insight into her writing process. In these letters, Jane mentions that the smaller your scope and the more limited in a sense you are, the better. This will produce something a bit more disciplined and more grounded in reality.
In September 1814, Jane wrote to her niece, "You are now collecting your people delightfully, getting them exactly into such a spot as is the delight of my life. 3 or 4 families in a country village is the very thing to work on, and I hope you will write a great deal more and make full use of them while they are so very favourably arranged."
So it's inevitable that some of Jane Austen's experiences, some of the incidents in her life, would have filtered over into her novels, and in some cases this may have even been deliberate. What we should also note is that she drew from the experience of other people in her life. Take Cassandra Austen, for example, Jane Austen's sister.
So brace yourselves, because in talking about Cassandra, I'm going to have to talk about yet another Tom. I really hope someone is keeping count here. Cassandra became engaged to Tom Fowle around the same time, actually, that Jane and Tom Lefroy met each other. Their engagement was initially a secret, and Tom Fowle set off on a voyage to the West Indies with his cousin, Lord Craven. While there, Tom Fowle caught yellow fever and died in 1797. This period between 1797 and 1798 would have been a time of great mourning for Cassandra, and Jane Austen was there to witness it all. Jane herself was suffering from her own heartbreak. It was said that in the aftermath of Tom Fowle's death, that Jane Austen really admired her older sister's fortitude and restraint in her grief. And so it's interesting to compare the situation with these two sisters to what we see developing in the first published novel of Jane Austen, Sense and Sensibility, which also centres around two sisters. J.E.L. certainly develops this in his memoir and suggests that Eleanor in Sense and Sensibility was modelled on Cassandra, although he doesn't think that the passionate, reckless Marianne was modelled on Jane Austen.
What do you know of my heart? What do you know of anything but your own suffering? For weeks, Marianne, I've had this pressing on me, without being at liberty to speak of it to a single creature.
Cassandra's engagement and subsequent loss is included in Becoming Jane, which is another reason why I really liked this film when I returned to it. It's not just for the sake of accuracy that it's included, but also because I think witnessing the loss that her sister went through was part of what fueled Jane's creativity.
You cannot know the depth of my despair. Phoebe would have married me before I went to sea. But I told her we should wait for money. Money.
What was the value of this love story if these two young people were only to be torn apart by a cruel great uncle, by a scheming neighbour, and by various other circumstances? The value is that they've both been changed by the experience, or at least Jane has been changed. Tom, by contrast, is more unveiled as the film progresses. In the scene in which Jane and Tom are about to elope, and Jane suddenly discovers the letter that reminds her that Tom has a family depending on him for income, Jane confronts Tom for having presented himself as this very careless individual, when in fact all the time he was this very responsible son and nephew who was looking out for his family. This representation of him is a lot closer to what we see in Benjamin Langlaw's letters and the memoir that his son wrote about him, of this almost perfect man who is so aware of his own responsibilities, who had such a strong sense of honour, that he certainly wouldn't have formed an understanding with Jane Austen and then left her only to marry a wealthy woman.
So in Becoming Jane, why does the love change Jane and not Tom? Well, Jane is the one who changes because she is the creator. She is the writer in a metatextual sense of her own story. Because the film shows that they are intellectual equals, its ending, where we see Jane reading from her most famous novel to a crowd of admirers, including Tom Lefroy and his daughter. This ending is so satisfying because we see that Jane, at Tom's urging, has become the great writer that he always knew she could be.
This is suggested from the start of the film, where Tom and Jane's relationship plays out in this very antagonistic courtship that I've already discussed. We have the scene in the library where Tom suggests to Jane that in order to become a better writer, she must gain experience. And what he means in this scene is sexual experience.
And what qualifies you to offer this advice?
I know more of the world.
A great deal more, I gather.
And you could argue that there are sexist aspects to this.
As her nephew wrote in the memoir, she was limited in terms of what she could write about due to her knowledge, which can come across as a little patronising to the modern reader. However, in the context of the time, in which the women of JEAL's class were still often confined to the home and not granted the same level of education as their male counterparts, we can see what he means. Once we take away the patronising aspect, it's a praise of Jane Austen's discipline
of her discernment in not attempting to depict something of which she had no first-hand knowledge. What we should also remember about JEAL is that he had his own agenda in writing Jane Austen's memoir. Around the time that he began to write it, which was in the late 1860s, Jane Austen's fame was growing, and if some member of her family hadn't undertaken a memoir of her, then most likely some other unauthorised memoirs would have cropped up. Similar to what we see with Tom Lefroy's son writing his memoir, Jane Austen's descendants were very concerned with preserving her image in the way that they wanted it to be.
He very interestingly, for instance, omits Jane Austen's dislike of the Prince Regent, which we do know from one of her letters. Because she was forced to dedicate one of her novels to him, JEAL kind of suggests that she was very honoured to do so. He makes no mention of the fact that she disliked him. Now, it's possible he didn't know this. He didn't have access to all of her letters. But there are definitely gaps in this memoir that he writes of Jane Austen.
Some persons have surmised that she took her characters from individuals with whom she had been acquainted. But surely such a supposition betrays an ignorance at a high prerogative of genius to create out of its own resources imaginary characters.
I would also say that JEAL's view of Jane Austen's writing in this way might have something to do with the fact that he didn't want their neighbours to think that they had caricatured them. Something we also saw Caroline Austen reacting against was this kind of embarrassment around the story that had grown up about Jane Austen and Tom Lefroy.
I know more of the world.
A great deal more, I gather.
Enough to know that your horizons must be widened.
In the film, given the need to present Tom as this different Austen hero, it's kind of understandable that this sexual experience becomes the focus of Jane's writing abilities. However, by the end of the film, we see that he has modified this argument. As Tom sits opposite her, listening to her read from her novel, we see the admiration and respect in his eyes. He may not have changed, per se, but he has gained respect for her, and will cherish her memory for the rest of his life, which will be much longer than hers.
Dare not say that man forgets sooner than woman, that his love has an earlier death. I have loved none but you. Unjust I may have been, weak and resentful I have been, but never inconstant.
So we come again to Thomas Edward Preston Lefroy's letter.
You have already given in a few sentences the chief part of what my late venerable uncle told me. He did not state in what her fascination consisted, but he said in so many words that he was in love with her, although he qualified his confession by saying it was a boyish love. As this occurred in a friendly and private conversation, I feel some doubt whether I ought to make it public.
Scholars such as Joan Klingel, as well as Tom Lefroy's descendant, have questioned what this really means, whether boyish love can qualify as a confession of love at all. But what I find remarkable about this conversation between T.E.P. Lefroy and his uncle is that when it took place, Tom Lefroy had to have been at least 90 years old. Jane Austen had been dead at that point for more than half a century. Yes, her fame had grown by now, and certainly many people would have been discussing her novels. If we're to believe that Tom Lefroy did buy her rejection letter, we can also conclude that he read her novels and was a fan, too, of her writing. But it wasn't as though he wanted to profit off of her fame. He had his own distinction. He had become Chief Justice of Ireland in his lifetime, and he had achieved great success in his career. Why would he have wanted to attach his name to Jane Austen's? As T.E.P. Lefroy says, he had no idea that this conversation would eventually be made public. He had no idea that 200 years later, sad individuals like myself would have been turning over his words and analysing whether or not he in fact loved her.
If there is a shred of truth or justice inside of you, you cannot marry him.
Oh no, Mr. Lefroy, justice by your own admission, you know little of truth, even less.
Jane, I have tried. I have tried, and I cannot live this lie.
The Mr. Weasley that we see, though he was entirely created for the film, is possibly a nod to Harris Bigwither, another great name, who was a rich gentleman who did subsequently propose to Jane Austen. Austen initially accepted his proposal, but then the following morning went back on her decision. It's speculated that she initially accepted the proposal out of a sense of financial responsibility, similar to what we see Charlotte Lucas talking about earlier in this video. There was also a suggestion of another romance and loss, that this one is riddled with so many contradictions that it's very hard to find any evidence at all of it. Apparently, Jane had met a gentleman at the seaside during the time when she and her sister and her mother were moving between various different houses. Jane and this gentleman, whom some accounts have named as Mr. Blackall, formed a connection and possibly even had an understanding. But the man's sudden death soon afterwards put an end to this sad little romance, as Cassandra Austen later described it. Possibly there were other romances that we don't know about. But when we look at this period of Jane Austen's life, it's hard not to reflect that this experience of constant loss, heartbreak, that this eventually was worked into her novels. The central question that we really come down on is the question to which no one has ever yet found an answer. Where do writers find their inspiration?
However, I think there's also something very powerful in the idea of life experience, bitter as it might be, forming you into a better writer or a better artist. The way I see it is that Tom Lefroy was the love of Jane Austen's life, even if she wasn't the love of his. And I think that to be remembered by someone more than half a century after you've died, even though your interaction with that person may have only taken place over the course of a few weeks or months, is more than a lot of us could ask for in our lives. Becoming Jane is a Hollywood film, and it stages romantic love as the most important aspect of a person's life, as the stuff that genius is made of. But stories about writers have to have their own dramatic arc, and what better arc can you achieve in the course of a standard Hollywood feature film than a love story? Becoming Jane has this love story, but it also tries to remain true to the real life people that this love story revolves around. Most impressively, I think, it attempts to portray both, although not in a perfect light, in a light that is positive, which, given the contradictory accounts that we have and the way that both characters could so easily be maligned because of this story, I think is quite remarkable.
And no, Anne Hathaway's accent is not that bad.
I will not accept this.
Before I go, a huge thank you to my fantastic readers in this video who performed their roles with aplomb and who read through the lengthy emails that I sent as context without a word of complaint. Thank you guys very much. 2 of my readers would prefer to remain anonymous, just as Jane Austen did at the start of her own career. But the other 2 have fantastic blogs, which I will recommend to you now. So if you were offended by the negative portrayal of the military as seen with Jane Austen's treatment of Wickham, then look no further than the Military Realism Report, which takes an analytic and scientific look at depictions of military in pop culture. Then there's the 1919 review. Something that my video was missing was a little bit of Marxist analysis. And you can find this in the 1919 review, but you can also find much more. Not only does it explore revolutionary history, but it also explores culture, reviews of books, TV shows and films, as well as discussions on current events. Thank you so much, guys, for watching. Please tell me in the comments what you think of the Jane Austen-Tom Lefroy romance. Was it exaggerated? Was it in fact downplayed? Did it happen at all? Do let me know in the comments what you think. I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you guys next time.